Look what Sophie got me for my birthday. My mother-in-law Helen announced to the entire family gathered in her lavish living room, holding up the small silver locket with exaggerated disdain. A dollar store trinket. I suppose this is what happens when you let children shop at discount stores. My heart sank as I watched my 8-year-old daughter's face crumple. Sophie had spent months saving her allowance for that locket, carefully selecting it because it matched the antique one in her grandmother's jewelry box. The one Helen always bragged about inheriting from her own mother. "Mom," my husband Jack started, but Helen cut him off with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "No, Jack, she needs to learn. In this family, we give proper gifts, not," she dangled the locket between two fingers like it was contaminated, "cheap costume jewelry." I pulled Sophie closer as tears welled up in her big brown eyes. She had been so excited about giving her grandmother this gift, had practiced her presentation all morning. "Actually, Helen, Sophie picked that out specially because—" "I'm sure she did," Helen interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. "Just like she picked out those clearance rack clothes she's wearing. Really, Emily, you should teach her about quality." She turned to my sister-in-law Victoria, who sat smirking on the expensive leather sofa. "Remember the diamond bracelet your Lily gave me last year? Now that was a proper birthday gift." Lily, my 11-year-old niece, preened at the praise. We all knew the bracelet had been bought with Victoria's credit card, just like all the gifts Lily gave. Before I could respond, Helen stood up and walked deliberately to the ornate trash bin beside her desk. "I think it's best if we just—" She dropped the locket in with a theatrical sigh. "Dispose of this unfortunate mistake. Perhaps next year you'll think harder about appropriate gifts for this family." The room fell silent except for Sophie's muffled sobs against my shoulder. Even Jack's father, George, usually buried in his newspaper during these scenes, looked up with disapproval at his wife's behavior. "Mother," Jack's voice was tight with anger, "that was completely unnecessary." Helen simply shrugged, already moving on to opening her next gift, an expensive-looking package from Victoria. "Sometimes children need to learn hard lessons about standards, dear." I stood up, Sophie trembling in my arms. "We're leaving," I announced, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. This wasn't the first time Helen had belittled our family's more modest lifestyle. But attacking my daughter's heartfelt gift was a new low. "Oh, don't be so sensitive," Victoria chimed in, adjusting her designer sweater. "Sophie needs to learn how things work in better circles. Not everyone shops at," she wrinkled her nose, "discount stores." Jack stood too, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Victoria. Mother, your behavior is appalling. Sophie worked hard to buy you something special." "Special?" Helen scoffed, carefully opening Victoria's gift. "There's nothing special about cheap." Her words cut off as she lifted out an expensive silk scarf. "Now this is what I mean by proper gifts. Victoria, darling, it's perfect." I couldn't take any more. Still holding Sophie, I headed for the door, Jack right behind us. George finally spoke up from his chair. "Helen, you've gone too far this time." "Oh, please," Helen dismissed him with a wave. "I'm teaching valuable lessons about quality and family standards." As we reached the door, Sophie lifted her tear-stained face from my shoulder. "But Grandma," she whispered, her voice breaking, "didn't you see what was inside?" Helen paused in her admiration of the silk scarf. "Inside." "The locket," Sophie continued, hiccuping slightly. "I put the picture inside. The one of you and your mom. From your jewelry box." The color drained from Helen's face. "What picture?" "The one you always talk about, from the antique locket your mom gave you. I saw it was fading, so I had Daddy help me scan it and make a copy, so you'd have it forever." Helen's perfectly composed expression cracked. She rushed to the trash bin, pushing aside tissue paper to retrieve the discarded locket. Her hands shook as she tried to open it. "Here," Jack said coldly, stepping forward to help with the clasp. The locket sprang open, revealing a perfectly restored black and white photograph of a young Helen with her mother, both smiling at the camera. "But, how?" Helen stared at the photo, her hands trembling. "The original is so faded, I can barely see it anymore." "Sophie noticed," I said quietly, still holding my daughter. "She saw how sad you were that the photo was fading. She asked Jack to help her restore it digitally. She saved her allowance for 3 months to buy a locket that matched your mother's." Victoria's smug expression faltered as she watched her mother sink into the nearest chair, still staring at the open locket. I just wanted you to have a nice picture of you and your mommy, Sophie sniffled, since you miss her so much. The silence in the room was deafening. Helen's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock and shame flooding her face as she looked from the restored photo to her sobbing granddaughter. For once, Helen seemed at a loss for words. I didn't know. No, Jack said firmly, you didn't bother to know. You were too busy judging the price tag to see the value of Sophie's gift. George stood up, walking over to look at the photo in the locket. Helen, he said softly, your mother would be ashamed of how you behaved today. Helen's careful composure crumbled completely at those words. She stood up, taking an unsteady step toward us, the locket clutched to her chest. Sophie, But I'd had enough. We're going home now, I said firmly. Sophie needs some time to recover from learning how her grandmother really feels about her gifts. As we walked to the car, I could hear Helen calling after us, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. But some lessons about family and value couldn't be undone with a simple apology. Sometimes the cheapest things carry the most precious weight, and the most expensive gifts can reveal the poorest of spirits. Sophie was quiet on the ride home, her small hand wrapped tightly around mine in the backseat while Jack drove. She had stopped crying, but the hurt in her eyes made my heart ache. What she learned today about family and worth couldn't be measured in dollar signs or designer labels. What Helen didn't know was that this incident would set in motion a chain of events that would completely transform our family dynamics. Sometimes it takes a child's pure heart to expose the tarnish on what others consider golden. The week following the Locket incident was unusually quiet. No calls from Helen, no passive-aggressive texts from Victoria about family obligations. Even Jack's father, George, who usually played peacekeeper, maintained his distance. Sophie slowly regained her sparkle, though I noticed she had started hiding her allowance jar in her closet instead of proudly displaying it on her dresser. Maybe I should just give people cards from now on, she said one morning, pushing her cereal around the bowl. No, sweetheart, I said, sitting beside her. Never let anyone make you feel ashamed of giving from your heart. Then, 10 days after the birthday disaster, an unexpected visitor arrived at our door. It was George, looking more serious than usual, carrying a worn leather photo album. Is Sophie home? He asked, shifting uncomfortably on our front porch. There's something she needs to see. Sophie was in the backyard, working on her fairy garden, another project Helen had dismissed as common. When I called her in, she'd approached her grandfather cautiously. Since the Locket incident, she'd grown wary of family interactions. Come sit with me, Pumpkin. George patted the couch beside him. I want to show you something about your grandmother, about Helen's mother. He opened the photo album carefully, revealing pages of old photographs. This, he pointed to a faded image of a young woman in a simple dress, was your great-grandmother Rose. Helen doesn't talk about this much, but Rose didn't come from money. She worked as a seamstress. Sophie leaned closer, studying the photograph. But Grandma Helen always talks about her fancy family traditions. George's laugh held a touch of sadness. Those came later. Rose used to make all of Helen's clothes by hand. She saved for months to buy that locket, the one Helen keeps in her jewelry box. It wasn't expensive, but it was the most precious thing she owned. I sat down on Sophie's other side, equally fascinated. Helen had always painted a picture of old money and inherited elegance. This was a side of family history she'd never shared. Rose taught Helen to sew. George continued, turning pages to show more photos. They used to make dolls together using scraps from Rose's work. Helen would sell them at school fairs to help with household expenses. She was so proud of those dolls. But Grandma Helen hates handmade things, Sophie said quietly. She said they're not proper gifts. George closed the album gently. After Rose died, Helen changed. She married me, and suddenly she had access to the kind of life she thought her mother deserved but never had. Somewhere along the way, she forgot the value of things made with love. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made Sophie gasp, the silver locket she'd given Helen. Your grandmother asked me to return this to you, he said, but quickly continued when Sophie's face fell. Not because she doesn't want it. She wants you to help her with something special. He opened the locket, showing not just the restored photos Sophie had placed inside, but now a second picture had been added to the empty side. A recent photo of Helen with Sophie at last year's Christmas dinner, before things had gotten so tense. She'd like you to teach her how you restored the old photo, George explained. She has a box of Rose's old photographs in the attic, all fading away. She thought maybe, if you're willing, you could help her save them together. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? But I thought. Sometimes, I said, squeezing her shoulder, people need a reminder of where they came from to see clearly where they are. George nodded. Helen's been up in the attic every day since your gift, looking through Rose's things. She found her old sewing box with one of those dolls they made together. He smiled at Sophie. It reminded her of your fairy garden, how you use bits and pieces to make something magical. Sophie sat quietly for a moment, processing this new version of her grandmother. Does this mean she's not mad about the locket anymore? Oh, pumpkin, George's voice cracked slightly. She was never mad about the locket. She was mad at herself for becoming someone her mother wouldn't recognize. Your gift, it helped her see that. He stood up, straightening his jacket. She'd like to come over tomorrow, if that's okay. She has some old photos she'd like your help with. And he smiled. She mentioned something about wanting to learn how to make fairy gardens. After George left, Sophie held the locket carefully, looking at the two photos inside, past and present, expensive and modest, all held together in what Helen had called a cheap trinket. Mom, she said thoughtfully, do you think Grandma Helen would like to help with my new fairy garden? I saved some special stones just for it. I smiled, remembering George's words about Helen's handmade dolls. I think she'd love that, sweetheart. Sometimes the most valuable things we can give each other aren't things at all. That evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she had one more question. Mom, can we stop at the craft store tomorrow? I want to get some stuff to make a fairy garden with Grandma Helen. A really special one. I kissed her forehead, marveling at her capacity for forgiveness. Of course we can, and Sophie, I'm so proud of how you've handled all this. You're teaching our whole family something important about love and value. She smiled, clutching her locket. Maybe we can help Grandma Helen make her own fairy garden, one with little dolls like she used to make. As I turned out her light, I thought about Helen, alone in her attic with her mother's old sewing box, rediscovering pieces of herself she'd packed away. Sometimes it takes a child's simple gift to unlock the most complicated parts of ourselves. The transformation in Helen over the next few months was remarkable. What started with photo restoration sessions with Sophie turned into weekly crafting afternoons at our house. The woman who once sneered at anything not bought from a luxury boutique now sat cross-legged in our backyard, helping Sophie to arrange tiny pebbles and miniature plants in their ever-growing fairy garden. Victoria stopped by one afternoon, designer handbag swinging, and nearly dropped her phone at the sight of her mother wearing gardening gloves and a simple cotton shirt. Mother, what are you doing? She asked, horrified. You're getting dirt on your clothes. Helen looked up, her face peaceful in a way I'd never seen before. I'm helping my granddaughter create magic, she said simply. Would you like to join us? Victoria fled, muttering about family standards, but Helen just shook her head and returned to helping Sophie position a tiny handmade swing made from twigs and twine. The real breakthrough came when Helen brought down the box of dolls she'd made with her mother. Sophie sat entranced as Helen demonstrated the simple stitches Rose had taught her, showing how to turn scraps of fabric into tiny treasures. My mother could make something beautiful out of anything, Helen said softly, demonstrating a French knot for Sophie's benefit. She used to say that love was the finest material you could work with. Together, Helen and Sophie started creating dolls for the fairy garden, each one carefully dressed in bits of lace and ribbon from Rose's old sewing box. Helen's skilled fingers, remembering lessons from long ago, guided Sophie's smaller ones through each stitch. One Sunday afternoon, I overheard Helen talking to Jack in the kitchen while Sophie and I set up for their crafting session. I've been such a fool, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I spent years trying to buy the kind of class I thought my mother deserved. But Rose, she had more grace in her worn thimble than I shone with all my expensive things. Jack hugged his mother, something he hadn't done in years. Mom, Sophie's gift didn't just restore that photo. It restored you. As the holidays approached, Helen insisted on hosting Thanksgiving as usual. Victoria arrived with Lily, both dressed to the nines, expecting the usual formal affair. Instead, they found the elegant dining room transformed. Handmade centerpieces graced the table, fairy gardens in antique teacups, each containing tiny dolls that Sophie and Helen had created together. Place cards were decorated with pressed flowers from their garden projects. And there, in the center of it all, stood Helen's prized crystal vase, filled not with expensive arrangements but with wildflowers Sophie had gathered. But what will people think? Victoria sputtered, staring at the handcrafted decorations. They'll think, Helen said firmly, that this family has remembered what truly matters. The biggest surprise came after dinner. Helen gathered everyone in the living room, where she'd set up a small gift for each person. Victoria and Lily opened theirs to find exquisitely crafted dolls, dressed in tiny versions of outfits they'd worn to past family events. Sophie and I made them together, Helen explained, beaming with pride. Each one is unique, just like our memories. Even Victoria's carefully maintained facade cracked when she recognized the fabric in her doll's dress. A piece of the baby blanket she'd long forgotten about. But it was Sophie's gift that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Helen handed her a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside lay Rose's original locket, carefully polished. My mother would have wanted you to have this, Helen said softly. You remind me so much of her, seeing the beauty in simple things, creating treasure from what others might overlook. Sophie launched herself into her grandmother's arms, both of them crying and laughing at once. The two lockets, one ancient, one new, clinked together as they hugged, a perfect harmony of past and present. Later that evening, as families began to leave, I found Helen and Sophie sitting in the garden, working on a new fairy house by the porch light. You know, Helen said, carefully gluing a tiny door made from popsicle sticks, my mother always said that the best gifts can't be bought. I forgot that for a while, but thanks to you, Sophie, I remember now. Sophie leaned against her grandmother, both of them dirty and happy. Can we make more dolls tomorrow, Grandma? I want to learn that special stitch you showed me. Of course, darling. And maybe it's time I taught you how to use Rose's old sewing machine. I think she'd like that. As I watched them together, I realized that Sophie's cheap locket had unlocked something priceless. The true heart of our family, bound together not by designer labels or price tags, but by love, memories, and tiny stitches that reached across generations. The fairy garden continues to grow, filled with handmade treasures and love. And if you look closely, you might see two lockets hanging from the smallest tree, one old, one new, both containing pictures of grandmother and granddaughter, bound together by something far more valuable than gold.